This podcast is a JPHMP Direct Talk feature. On this podcast, Dr. Lloyd Novick speaks with Dr. Celeste Philip about preparedness efforts and major actions that were essential during a 2016 outbreak of Zika in the Florida counties of Miami-Dade and Broward. Dr. Philip is former Surgeon General and Secretary of the Florida Department of Health. Thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
We're very excited to hear about your work, Dr. Philip. So we're going to hop right into your narrative with some questions from Dr. Novick.
Dr. Philip, when you first learned of the locally transmitted Zika case in Florida in July 2016, were you surprised, or was this something you were ready for? What were your first reactions and actions?
We had been preparing for this scenario for several months at this point. I wouldn't say that we were surprised. I would say we hoped we wouldn't find ourselves in this situation. But that is why public health preparedness is so important, because you never quite know what the scenario might be, when it might happen, and the time that we spent preparing certainly put us in a good position to be responsive. Once we confirmed that this was indeed a case of Zika that was not travel-related, we turned to our playbook that had all of our planned activities in the order that we thought would be most appropriate, and we moved forward.
Right after that first case, you learned that you were actually dealing with 4 cases, I believe. And right away, you and the governor made a public announcement about that situation. Why did you think it was important to go public so quickly rather than wait for more information or more surveillance before you went public?
As soon as there was a public health emergency declaration in the state that was connected to the first travel-related cases, we committed at the Department of Health to providing a daily update on any new information on Zika cases. For several months, those were all travel-related cases. As soon as we had enough data, and I want to remind everyone that at this time, a confirmed case required multiple tests, so that included sending labs to CDC for confirmation. Once that occurred and we were certain these were all confirmed cases, and we started to put the pieces together to understand how they may have been connected, we felt it was important to share that information, much as we had been doing in our daily updates for other cases that we were aware of. We knew that there would be a lot of questions, a lot of interest, a lot of concern, given that this was around the time that CDC also shared with everyone that they had sufficient evidence to say that the Zika virus was definitely causing microcephaly, congenital microcephaly, and other conditions that were concerning for fetuses and infants. So we knew that it was our duty to make sure that the public was aware as soon as we felt confident in our information.
How did you interact with the governor throughout this challenge? He obviously, from reading the case, he obviously had a great deal of confidence in you and your department. Can you tell us about your relationship with the governor, which clearly grew throughout the months that you were working with him on this?
I had been a state health officer by July for only 3 or 4 months, and it was interesting that the planning allowed for me to have more direct conversations with Governor Scott. I think if we had not had a public health concern of this nature and this magnitude, I probably would have seen him much less. In those meetings, it was an opportunity to talk about not only the plan specific for Zika, but about public health preparedness in general, about the role of public health. And even though Governor Scott had been in his position for, I think it was close to 6 years at that point, this was the first major response in Florida that highlighted what public health does and why it's so important to invest in your workforce and capabilities. Over time, leading up to when we had those first cases, we had spent time traveling around the state in what we called Zika roundtables to talk with local officials about their plans, make sure that they were exercising, making sure that mosquito control districts had the resources that they needed. That face-to-face time helped us to develop a relationship within a short amount of time that proved to be extremely important when we then were dealing with local transmission, initially a few cases, and then what ended up being many more. That relationship was extremely important, and I think for any state health officer that has the opportunity to initiate, develop, nurture that relationship, whether it's the governor or an HHS secretary or whoever that person may be, it helps you to do your job well, to feel supported, and also, depending on the situation, have access to additional resources that you may not have had otherwise.
Another important relationship in this case was your interaction with the Centers for Disease Control. Where did you find CDC guidance to be useful, and where did you strike out on your own and amplify CDC guidance or do things that the CDC wasn't actually guiding you to do?
For most of us in public health, CDC guidelines are our bread and butter of how we operate. When you are dealing with a novel emerging situation where even CDC guidelines are, I think at that time they all had the name interim or alluded to the fact that these were preliminary or that we're very early on in our understanding of Zika, that posed a different challenge, and it was a different scenario than I had ever found myself before. As much as possible, we adhered to those guidelines, whether it was about messaging or testing, how to interact with other health partners to provide the best information that we had to parents or expecting parents, which in the beginning was difficult because we didn't know a whole lot about what number one, in the very beginning, we did not know definitively about the connection with microcephaly and the other, what became known as congenital Zika syndrome. It was not well understood how long the virus might persist in semen, and for quite some time, the guidelines changed regarding when to only have barrier-protected sex or to abstain. How you have those discussions and weighing the pros and cons for each couple can be quite complex. We shared all of the guidelines. We pushed them out to all of licensed providers in the state as well as hospitals, FQHCs, universities, other partners. As soon as those updates were released, there were some weeks where you might have one or two revised guidelines. Staying on top of all of those guidelines, in and of itself, it's own full-time job, but we all, as a team, try to make sure we shared information with each other and with partners as soon as possible. When we found ourselves dealing with ongoing local transmission through mosquitoes, sticking with the CDC guidelines around testing came into discussion. At that time, the guidelines suggested only testing for women who had spent time in a high-risk area. At that point in time in Florida, that meant parts of Miami-Dade County where we had identified that transmission was indeed occurring. However, if you can remember what the sense was at that time, there was still a lot of unknowns. It didn't feel very reassuring to say to women who maybe were just outside of those boundaries of what became called the Zika zones, or if you were in an adjacent county or, quite frankly, anywhere in the state where we knew Aedes aegypti mosquitoes were present, because we had so many travel-related cases in many different counties, Governor Scott came to me and said, could the department consider offering free risk assessment and testing for Zika virus for all pregnant women in the state? In that scenario, the answer had to be yes. We had some discussions with our colleagues at CDC to explain the approach. There was some back and forth discussion. I think there was a little bit of pushback and concern because that changes the confidence you can have in your test results when you start screening in a low-risk population. That increases the likelihood that you might have more false positives, which can create its own issue. However, we felt that for most women, this option of being able to undergo a risk assessment and testing would allow for a much better sense than saying, we're pretty sure you don't have Zika virus, even though 80% of people may be asymptomatic. That was not an appropriate response to help provide some reassurance and some options for pregnant women in our state.
Yes, another issue that you had to face was tourism. Tourism is, of course, a major industry in Florida, and as we know from the case that will be published in the journal, that there was a travel advisory. How did you handle the tourism issue?
The roundtable meetings that I mentioned previously included leadership from local tourism boards and groups. And as you noted, tourism is a major industry in nearly every part of the state, particularly in South Florida and some of the parts of Miami-Dade County where we found that Zika was being transmitted. We learned from the situation that involvement or engagement with local business organizations is important. And if I were to go through something similar again, would make sure that we included that important stakeholder group. They were brought in a little bit later as we were already in our response, and I think there were some assumptions about how information was being shared with some of the other leadership that had attended some of the planning meetings. During the height of our response, when the travel advisory was in place for the Zika zones that advised for pregnant women to not travel to those areas, we did see that there were significant impacts on tourism and on some people's jobs, unfortunately. There were a number of conferences, events that were canceled as a result. We worked very closely with the hotel industry and other entertainment venues to make sure that they understood what people could do to protect themselves, such as clothing that covered all or most of your skin, making sure that repellent was available through many different mechanisms, including at visitor centers. Some hotels chose to provide mosquito repellent or insect repellent in the rooms or in the lobbies. There was a point in South Florida where you could find it nearly everywhere. And that was part of the protective response to say to individuals, if you are going to be here, this is what you can do. And especially if you are not a pregnant woman, we wanted people to still feel like they had options and this is what they could do individually. After all of the Zika zones were cleared, we saw that the area did rebound nicely. And for the calendar year, if you look at numbers across the span of the year, the average for tourism, the number of individuals that travel to different parts of the state was maintained. So we didn't see any long-term impacts, but that was part of the motivation to make sure we could disrupt transmission as soon as possible, because as we say in public health, your education and your job are the most important factors for your overall health. So there are those implications as well.
Yes, and can you tell us about your relationship with the media? Clearly, the newspapers and TV were after you to get as much information as they could. What was your approach to this?
The daily Zika update was the initial attempt by the department to share information on a regular basis at a time certain to try to manage the number of calls that the department was receiving. And some days it was 20 to 30, some days it may have only been a couple. We had established a hotline for the general public to call with questions, but media questions were coming directly through either the governor's office or through the Department of Health or possibly sister agencies. And we were trying to do what we could to be proactive with sharing data to minimize those calls. In the beginning, many of the articles emphasize the steps that I just mentioned about what an individual could do to protect themselves. That included getting rid of standing water, making sure you checked for bromeliads in your lawn, emphasizing that a cap full of water was enough for mosquito larvae eggs to develop and for you to have Aegypti in your yard. A lot of the messaging was to remain vigilant and do these things. After we announce that we had our first case of local transmission, and then in short order that we had identified additional cases, and that indeed we saw that there was a epidemiological link between some of these cases. The scrutiny was quite intense from that point forward. The tone of the articles started to shift a bit at that point, and I try to remember that the role of media is to sometimes be attention-grabbing with the words that they choose because they want people to read their articles. That's part of how they inform the public, and also for them to be able to survive in this world of changing ways of how people receive information. And I started to see that shift pretty quickly. Due to some of the situation in Miami, I think it got to a point where on some days there were a lot of questions about decisions that the Department of Health was making, that I was making, and questioning of motives, which I think is normal to happen. So what I would say to anyone in that situation is you should expect it, and you can't take it personally because you're doing your job, and as a reporter or as a member of the media, they are doing what they feel is their job.
Well, this has been a very helpful discussion, and looking back about this challenge, which certainly was energy-intensive effort by you and your department, is there any other guidance that you can give state health officials or public health workers who may be facing critical situations like this in the future?
Planning and exercise cannot be underestimated, but you also can't predict every scenario. We found some of that in our response to Zika virus as well as a few other responses. So you have to remain nimble, patient, and appreciate each other. You do have long days. You can be in very tense and stressful situations. And in the end, as the state health officer, you are representing an entire department, or depending on the scenario, in our case, multiple state agencies. And you're not doing it alone. You are doing it with many hundreds, if not thousands of people that are all playing important roles. So remembering to check in with each other, to thank each other, to value the contribution of each team member helps to sustain you as you persist in whatever efforts you have given the scenario. And for me personally, I will look back and remember some of those discussions, some of those very tough decisions that we had to make, that I ultimately had to be able to defend and describe the rationale. And it was me with lots of other people providing that expertise and support that helped us to ultimately be successful, helped me to learn and grow so much from the experience, and in the end, help to elevate the importance of public health. And that is something for me I will always remember and be grateful for.
Well stated and well done, Dr. Philip. An example of rising to a public health challenge with a successful conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning into another JPHMP Direct Talk feature. A special thanks to Dr. Celeste Philip for joining us to discuss Zika preparedness efforts during a 2016 outbreak in Florida. This podcast is a JPHMP production. Check out journals and supplements at journals.lww.com/JPHMP. And also check out our companion site, JPHMP Direct, an online community for advances in public health.